William Harris, a successful millionaire executive, lives in a luxurious penthouse with a view of New York City. He's built a vast empire in industries like oil, finance, and real estate, but his personal life is cold and disconnected. Years ago, William had a brief affair with Maya, an African maid working at his estate. When Maya discovered she was pregnant, William panicked. Fearing the scandal it would cause, he forced her to leave without any support. He believed that by sending her away the problem would disappear. Over time, he convinced himself that Maya had moved on and forgotten about him. His life continued without any thought of her or the consequences of his actions. William's world was full of wealth and success, but it lacked the emotional ties that could have given it true meaning. William had been preparing for this business trip to London for weeks. It was a huge opportunity, a deal with one of the fastest-growing tech companies in Africa. He was eager to finalize everything and add another achievement to his long list of successes. As usual, he was focused on the numbers, the profit margins, and the potential expansion of his empire. Emotions had no place in the world he had built. He arrived at the sleek conference room, where a group of top executives from the tech company were waiting. The meeting started, and William quickly took control, leading the discussions with his usual confidence. He was in his element, discussing contracts and future investments with ease. As the meeting continued, William's attention shifted for a brief moment. A young man entered the room, tall and well-dressed, carrying himself with a calm confidence. His features were striking and there was something about him that caught William off guard. The young man had deep brown eyes, high cheekbones, and a strong jawline, traits that reminded William of someone. William tried to shake off the thought. It was impossible. He focused again on the meeting, but his mind kept drifting back to the young man. His name was James and he was the CEO's assistant. James had a quiet presence but a sharp intelligence that made him stand out among the others. As the meeting progressed, William found it hard to concentrate, his thoughts swirling. There was something about James that was so familiar, something that made him feel uneasy. The resemblance between James and himself was undeniable. The same intense gaze. The same sharp features. It was as though William were looking at a younger version of himself. But how could that be? William's heart began to race. Could it be? Could this man be his son? The thought hit him like a wave. For a moment, the room seemed to blur around him. William's mind began to race through the past, remembering his brief affair with Maya, the African maid who worked in his estate. She had disappeared from his life years ago, and he had never thought about her again. But now, seeing James, the connection seemed undeniable. After the meeting ended, William could no longer sit still. He needed to know the truth. He excused himself from the group and walked over to James. His heart was pounding in his chest as he called James aside. "James," William said, trying to keep his voice steady, "can I talk to you for a moment?" James looked at him with a polite, curious expression but nodded. "Of course, Mr. Harris." William cleared his throat, trying to gather his thoughts. This was insane, he thought. But he had to ask. "Where are you from?" William asked, keeping his voice calm. "I couldn't help but notice you look familiar. You're from Ghana, aren't you?" James raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Yes, Mr. Harris, I'm from Ghana." William's heart skipped a beat. "And your last name? What is it?" "James Kofi," James replied, smiling slightly, unaware of the storm brewing inside William. William's mind was spinning. Kofi. That was Maya's last name. Amina Kofi. "Do you know anything about your father?" William asked, his voice shaky despite his best efforts to remain calm. James looked at him, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "I never met him," he said simply. William froze. His chest tightened and for a moment he couldn't breathe. This was impossible. Could this really be his son? The realization hit him like a hammer. The same strong features, the same sharp eyes, it was all too much to ignore now. He tried to shove the thought away but it kept coming back, more persistent and undeniable. The conversation ended shortly after, and William stood there, motionless as James walked back into the meeting. His mind was in a whirlwind. He needed answers, but everything he had believed about his life was about to change. That night after the meeting, William couldn't shake the thought of James. The resemblance was undeniable, and the more he thought about it, the more his past came rushing back. He lay awake in his penthouse, staring out at the New York City skyline. The bright lights outside did nothing to calm the storm inside his mind. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Maya's face, the way she looked when she told him she was pregnant. He remembered the night she had come to him, trembling and desperate, telling him that she was going to have his child. At first he had been shocked, then angry but mostly afraid. He feared the scandal, the damage it would do to his reputation. Without even thinking, he had forced her to leave. He had told her it was for her own good, but deep down he knew it was to protect himself. Maya had begged him for help, for support, but William hadn't cared. He had sent her away with nothing, thinking it would be the end of it. He had convinced himself that she would forget about him, that she would move on. But now, seeing James, he couldn't help but wonder, what had happened to Maya? Had she struggled alone? Had she ever told James the truth? The guilt gnawed at him and he couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned, but the images of Maya's pleading face and the thought of James never left his mind. It was all too much to ignore. He knew he needed to find out what had really happened. He needed answers. The next morning, William made a decision. He couldn't leave things as they were. He needed to know what happened to Maya, and if James was truly his son. He called his lawyer and asked for help finding a private investigator. He had always avoided digging into his past, but now it was the only thing that mattered. Days later, the investigator called. William felt his heart race as he answered the phone. The investigator's voice was steady, but William could hear the weight in his words. "I've found some information, Mr. Harris," the investigator said. "I tracked down Maya. She passed away 5 years ago from an illness." William's heart sank. He had hoped to find her alive, perhaps starting a new life, but the truth was far more painful than he could have imagined. "Maya's gone?" William asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Yes," the investigator replied. "But there's more. Maya left behind letters addressed to her son. In those letters she speaks about you." William's stomach twisted. He had thought he could forget about Maya, but now it was clear that she had never forgotten him. The thought of the letters, of the words she had written for James, hit him like a blow to the chest. The investigator continued, "The letters are very emotional. She talks about how she was abandoned by you, but she also talks about how much she loved James and how she hoped you would one day acknowledge him." The realization shook William to his core. Maya had always loved James, even though William had turned his back on them both. And now she had written letters that James might one day read. The possibility of James learning the truth, learning that William had abandoned him and his mother, was almost too much to bear. William hung up the phone, his mind reeling. He had hurt Maya. He had hurt James. And now the past was catching up with him in the most unexpected way. The guilt weighed heavier than ever, and for the first time, William wasn't sure how to fix it. William couldn't stop thinking about the letters. The investigator had told him that Maya had written them for James, and now they were in his hands. He couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to know what Maya had said, what truths she had left behind. So William made the decision to travel to Ghana. It was a long journey, but it was the only way to find out the full story. When he arrived in Ghana, he felt a heaviness in his chest. The country felt so different from his life in New York. Everything was simpler, slower. He followed the directions the investigator had given him and made his way to a small, modest house on the outskirts of the city. The house was quiet, but there was a sense of peace about it. Maya had spent her final years here, raising James alone. An elderly woman, one of the neighbors, opened the door when William knocked. She looked at him curiously but could see the pain in his eyes. After a few moments of silence, she nodded and invited him inside. In a small, sunlit room, the woman led him to a shelf. On it were several old, yellowed envelopes. William's heart pounded as he reached for them. The letters were addressed to James, but it felt like they were written just for him. He sat down, his hands trembling as he opened the first letter. He read it slowly as if he were afraid of what it might say. "My dearest son," the letter began, "if you are reading this, I am no longer with you. But I need you to know the truth about me, about your father. I loved a man once. He was powerful and respected. I thought he cared for me, but when I told him I carried his child, he turned me away. I begged. I pleaded. But he was too afraid of what others would think. He chose his reputation over us." William's throat tightened as he read the words. Maya had written about the pain she felt when he turned his back on her. She had loved him, and yet he had abandoned her. The guilt that William had felt earlier now grew stronger, almost unbearable. The letter continued, "I don't want you to grow up hating him. That is not why I write this. I only want you to understand that you were never a mistake. You were never unwanted. I wanted you, James. I fought for you. I loved you more than life itself. And maybe one day, if fate is kind, your father will find the courage to love you too." Tears welled up in William's eyes as he finished reading. Maya's words were filled with so much love for James, and yet they were also filled with so much pain. She had suffered because of him, but she had never let go of the hope that he might one day come around. As William read more of the letters, the realization of what he had done became clearer. Maya had suffered alone, raising James without his support. She had fought for him, protected him, and loved him. And all the while, William had ignored them both, thinking only of himself. The weight of his mistakes crashed down on him. He had built an empire, but at what cost? He had gained so much, yet lost the most important thing, the chance to be a father. He realized that his actions had shaped James's life in ways he could never undo. The letters were more than just words on paper. They were a window into the pain and love Maya had carried with her. William had no idea what to do next, but one thing was clear. He couldn't keep running from his past anymore. A few days after William returned from Ghana, he received a call from James. The moment the phone rang, William felt his heart race. He had known this day would come, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the truth. "Mr. Harris," James's voice came through the phone, calm but firm. "We need to talk." William's stomach churned. "Of course. When and where?" "Now," James said. "I'm in New York. Meet me at the office." William hung up the phone, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. He wasn't sure what was about to happen, but he knew it would be difficult. He had spent years avoiding the truth, and now James was ready to confront him about it. When William arrived at James's office, he found James standing by the window, looking out over the city. James didn't turn when William entered. For a moment, there was silence between them, a heavy, uncomfortable silence. Finally, James spoke, his voice cold. "You know why I asked to meet, right?" William took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Yes, I know," he said quietly. "You found out the truth." James turned around slowly, his eyes intense. "I didn't just find out the truth, Mr. Harris," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I confirmed it. I had a DNA test done. You're my father." William felt a wave of guilt rush over him. He had feared this moment for so long, but now it was impossible to escape. James knew. And there was no hiding from the past anymore. James's eyes narrowed. "I've known for a while now. But hearing it from you, well, it's different." He paused, taking a step closer. "You abandoned my mother. You never cared about me. You turned your back on us." William's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to explain himself, but the words stuck. How could he explain the mistake he had made so many years ago? How could he make James understand the regret he had carried for all this time? I made a terrible mistake," William said, his voice trembling. "I hurt your mother. I hurt you. And I can never take that back. But I'm not that man anymore. I know it's too late to make up for what I did, but I want to try. I want to be a father to you now." James took a step back, his face unreadable. "You think saying sorry will fix everything? You think showing up now changes anything?" His voice was sharp, each word cutting deeper. "I grew up without a father. I had to fight for everything on my own. And now you want to step in and pretend like you care." William's heart broke at the anger in James's voice. He had no excuse for his actions, and he knew that James had every right to be angry with him. "I don't expect you to forgive me," William said, his voice low. "But I want to be part of your life. I want to make things right even if it takes time." James looked at him for a long moment, his expression softening just slightly. "I don't know if I can trust you," he said quietly. "You've hurt me. You've hurt my mother. And I don't know if I can ever let that go." William nodded slowly, understanding the weight of James's words. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," he said. "But I'll prove to you that I'm serious. I'll prove it with actions, not just words." James didn't say anything for a moment, and then he turned back to the window, looking out over the city. "We'll see," he said softly, his voice distant. "We'll see." With that, the conversation ended. William left the office, his mind racing. He knew he had a long road ahead of him. But for the first time in years, he felt like there was a chance to make things right. William knew that proving he was serious about making amends would take time. After his conversation with James, he understood that words alone wouldn't be enough. If he wanted to be a part of James's life, he would have to show up again and again and earn James's trust. So William made a commitment to himself. He would attend James's charity events, not as a businessman, but as a man who wanted to make things right. He wanted to get to know the person James had become, and he hoped that, little by little, James would see that he wasn't the same man who had abandoned him and his mother. At first, James kept his distance. He didn't smile when William entered the room, didn't engage in conversations with him beyond what was necessary. But William didn't mind. He was used to being in control, to making things happen with his wealth and power, but this was different. This was about humility, patience, and showing that he was ready to listen. As the weeks passed, William attended more and more events. He didn't try to talk about the past. He simply focused on supporting James and the causes that were important to him. He helped organize fundraisers, made generous donations, and even volunteered his time to help out. He knew it wasn't enough to just show up. He had to prove his commitment through actions, not just promises. One evening at a large charity gala, William found himself standing by the stage, surrounded by guests. The event was a celebration of Maya's life and the work she had done in building the charity that now helped so many. As William looked around the room, his eyes landed on a portrait of Maya, displayed prominently near the entrance. The portrait captured her kindness and strength, qualities William had once seen in her but had ignored at the time. Looking at the picture, William was overcome with a wave of regret. He remembered how he had sent Maya away without a second thought, how he had never even tried to understand the struggles she faced. And now, standing in the room where her legacy lived on, William felt the weight of his past actions more than ever. He had wronged her and he had wronged James. But looking at James now, seeing the man he had become, William also felt a sense of pride. James had grown into someone strong, intelligent, and compassionate, qualities he had clearly inherited from his mother. Despite everything, Maya had raised James to be a man of integrity. Later that evening, as the event wound down, James approached William. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened slightly as he spoke. "You've been showing up," he said. "You've been here for the charity, for the cause. But that's not enough. If you want to be a part of my life, you need to keep proving it. You need to show me you can be trusted. Words don't mean anything anymore." William nodded, understanding what James was saying. "I know," he replied. "I know it's going to take time. But I'll keep showing up. I'll prove it to you with my actions, not my words." James paused for a moment, then nodded. "We'll see," he said, his tone still guarded but less distant than before. That night, as William walked back to his car, he felt both a sense of hope and the reality of the long road ahead. He knew that James wasn't ready to forgive him, but for the first time, William believed that there was a chance. A chance to rebuild their relationship, a chance to make things right one step at a time. The night of the major charity gala finally arrived. It was the largest event of the year, and it had been months since William had started attending James's charity events, trying to prove he was serious about changing and making things right. William had shown up time and time again, not looking for praise or recognition but simply hoping to earn James's trust. As he walked into the grand hall, filled with people in elegant attire, William felt the weight of his actions heavy on his shoulders. He knew that James hadn't fully forgiven him and he wasn't sure if he ever would. But he kept showing up because, in his heart, he believed this was the only way forward. The work at the charity, the cause they were all supporting, meant more to him than any business deal or financial success. It was a chance to do something good, to make up for the mistakes of the past. The evening progressed with speeches, fundraising activities, and emotional stories shared by those who had benefited from Maya's charity. William stood in the background, keeping to himself as he watched James work the room with his usual charisma and passion. William had come to admire James's leadership, his dedication, and the way he spoke so freely about his mother's legacy. It was clear that James had made something meaningful of his life, despite the pain William had caused him. Then, just before the night's main program began, something unexpected happened. James, who had been circulating around the room, made his way toward William. Their eyes met across the crowd, and William braced himself for another cold exchange. But to his surprise, James nodded in his direction, a small but clear gesture that William had learned to recognize. "Come sit with me," James said, his voice quiet but firm. William felt a rush of emotions. This was the first time James had invited him to join him. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything. It was a sign that James was beginning to soften, that he was starting to accept him, at least in small ways. William nodded, his heart pounding in his chest, and followed James to a table at the front of the room. Sitting next to James felt surreal, like a dream William wasn't sure he deserved. The moment wasn't perfect, but it was progress. William sat there, grateful for the chance to be near his son, even if it wasn't a perfect reconciliation. The night continued, and William stayed focused on the cause. He spoke with donors, helped organize some of the events, and did everything he could to contribute. But the real change had already begun. James's small gesture had meant more than anything William could have imagined. It was the first sign that James was beginning to let go of the anger, beginning to see William not as the man who had abandoned him, but as the man who was trying to change. Over the next few months, William continued attending James's charity events, showing up again and again. He wasn't looking for forgiveness, but he was hoping for understanding. With each event, with each conversation, James's stance softened. He still hadn't fully forgiven William, but the walls were coming down little by little. William could see it in the way James interacted with him, less guarded, less distant. Though James hadn't forgiven him completely, there was now hope for the future. William knew it would take time, but for the first time in years he believed they could build something new. James had given him a chance, and now it was up to William to prove that he was serious about being a father. As the evening came to a close, William sat back in his chair, looking at his son across the table. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain. He was willing to fight for it every day. And that, at least, was a start.